If he is quote unquote humiliated in Ukraine, he will need to score a victory somewhere else relatively quickly. And that might mean trying to find a way to win over NATO and show how divided it is.
Let's get straight into it. How long has Vladimir Putin actually got left in power?
I mean, it's a good question. And it depends on, I would say, sort of two or three things. The first is whether anyone else within Russia is in a position to make a play against him. The last time that happened, you remember, was 2023 when the Wagner group marched against Moscow. Now, Putin's gone to a lot of effort to make sure that there are as few as possible other contenders for his position. And so that puts him in a slightly safer position. It's harder for someone to move against him. The second, I think, is what Russia's military and sort of industrial and business establishment makes of it. Obviously, he's no longer winning in Ukraine. For the last sort of 2 months or so, Ukraine has been taking back ground. So it's unlikely to be possible for him to move forward and take the whole Donbass as he had wanted. Now, obviously, the Russian military is not going to be very impressed if he can't deliver on the war that he's been pushing for 4 years now. Lasted about the same as the First World War. Obviously, Russia's economy is in a bit of a mess, but there are quite a lot of the people who is dependent on sort of military industrial complex types who are dependent on that war keeping going. And the third thing is Chinese support. So, as long as Xi Jinping is prepared to keep on buying Russian oil, prepared to keep supplying Putin's military machine, that makes his position more secure. So I think I would still be surprised if we saw a move against him in a hurry, but Putin himself is going to have to make moves to try and secure his position. And that may or may not include moving for a ceasefire in Ukraine, depending on what those different power centers want.
Will Putin just take the gains and ditch the maximalist demands?
I think there's probably not a just to it, but I think Putin is a survivor. If he decides he has to take a hit on a ceasefire in Ukraine, firstly, he's got to get the Americans to agree to it. There does seem to have been a bit of changing mood music there. So the Trump administration much more supportive of the government in Kyiv than it's been. Now, that may in part be designed to push him into a corner. Again, that Chinese support is really important. But the key thing is, if he does have to take a ceasefire in Ukraine, then he will need to deliver a victory on something else relatively soon. And that's what really worries people in Europe. Because if he is, quote unquote, humiliated in Ukraine, he will need to score a victory somewhere else relatively quickly. And that might mean trying to find a way to win over NATO and show how divided it is.
Do you see Russia launching an offensive anytime soon in Ukraine to take land?
I mean, they'll try and get as high a degree of surprise if they didn't do that. I mean, the one thing you might see Russia do is move forces back into Belarus. So when it moves forces into Belarus, it's able to threaten the Baltic states, the Suwałki Gap, so between Lithuanian and Polish territory, between Belarus and Kaliningrad. But it's also able to threaten Kyiv again. So if you see the Russians put troops north of Kyiv, then they're signaling they might try and break down and do another decapitation run. That would worry the Ukrainians quite a lot. So I think that's maybe more likely than an offensive, although they definitely would like to get back on the offensive in the Donbass. If they can find a way of doing it, they will. But, they've lost 500,000 troops. They have limitless more troops. There are ways of conducting offensives with drones. You put lots of drones down a simple gap and create a hole. I'm sure the Russians are looking at that. It wouldn't amaze me if it happened. But by the same token, I don't know that Putin can afford a botched defensive opponent. So he might feel safer just kind of keep it going where he is.
We're seeing the logistical lockdown campaign hammering the supply lines. Is Crimea there for the taking?
No, I mean, I think the one thing the Russians have been very clear about, particularly in 2022, when it looked like the Russian front might collapse, is that not just Putin, but the Russian establishment views Crimea as an existential piece of Russian territory. What that means is that they would be willing to threaten nuclear use for its protection. If the front line was to collapse, which is quite difficult to happen, I mean, the Russians have a lot of drones. Just because the Ukrainians are being able to take back some land, they're not going to be able to break through in the way they did in 2022. But you would see the Russians throw everything into that, and you would see them do what they did in 2022, which is put their nuclear arsenal on standby. And I think, certainly from what we know about the way in which the Trump administration does business, when the Trump administration sees a nuclear arsenal go on standby, as Pakistan did last year during that war with India, they tend to intervene very quickly, diplomatically, as did the Biden administration in 2022, to try and sort of placate the Russians, also to put a hand on Ukrainian shoulders and say, careful.
Is that why we haven't seen another massive strike on the Kerch Strait bridge?
Well, I think that's more of a tactical decision. The I mean, the Russians have no doubt put a lot of effort into protecting that bridge, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Ukrainians put another hole in it at some point the longer this war goes on. But that is very different to be able to break through on the ground to take Crimea. So, the Ukrainians have struck at Crimea frequently. It's very hard for the Russians to use Crimea as a naval base. So in that sense, Crimea's use is being denied to the Russian Navy. But that is not the same as capturing it. And of course, once the war is over, once there's a ceasefire, that ceasefire will involve Ukraine not striking Crimea anymore. And you'll see the Russians moving weapon systems back in very quickly, not just to be able to do the sort of rebase naval assets there, but also to build their strike capability into Ukraine so that if the war does resume, they can punch back into those Ukrainian cities.
What's your assessment of what's going on inside Russia at the moment?
There is a lot of stock taking. I mean, don't forget, Russia doesn't make decisions very quickly, ever. When things happen in Russia, they happen quickly eventually, but there's a lot of building up to it. So if you think about the revolutions in 1917, if you think about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, all of those were the culmination of months and years of things happening. And I think we're barely seeing those things start to happen now. You do get palace coups occasionally in Russia, but it's not that common. The question for Putin and anyone who wants to replace him is, how do you get to a situation where Putin gets to leave office politely and cleanly, possibly not now, but in a couple of years' time? How do you get a successor who is anointed in a way that passes the kind of the power? And how do you do that without the sort of collapse you saw in 1991? Because very few people in Russia enjoyed what happened in the 1990s. Some people got very rich, but those people who got rich worried they get poor if they're the same, in the same amount of kind of crisis. Russia is really, really paranoid about things they call sort of times of trouble, which is a phrase used for a really uncomfortable period back in late medieval history. But every time they've had it, they don't enjoy it. So I think there's going to be a lot of sort of moving around, and there's going to be elements, again, coming back to that Chinese picture, Russia is a lot more dependent on China than it's ever been before. And I suspect whoever does want to replace Putin, whether they just want to become a deputy now, and maybe replace him in a few years' time, or whether they're thinking of something a bit crunchier, their relationship with China is going to be important, and potentially with the US.
We've seen the deal with Sweden and Ukraine over the Gripen fighters. Do you think, and the Meteor missiles, is Europe on the right tracks, ready for a war, potential war?
I mean, I think Europe views Ukraine as being a war for European survival already. So, I think there's a feeling in Europe that as long as they keep Russia fixed in Ukraine, Russia won't come elsewhere. The Swedes, the press conference over giving the Gripen was interesting because the Swedes were very upfront in saying the Gripen was built to fight Russia in the sort of war Ukraine is fighting. So, it is designed to take off from rough airstrips. It was designed to defend Sweden against a Russian invasion, and now it's going to do the same job in Ukraine. And, if you look at, each national relationship with Ukraine is slightly different. The Germans the Germans have had a bit of a sort of spiky relationship. Armin Pappenjau, who is the head of Rheinmetall, the big German defense company, really upset a bunch of Ukrainians when he described their weapon systems as being built by housewives. He then saw Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, make the most forward visit that any European minister has. He went to the front line with Fedorov, who's the Ukrainian defense minister. Very fun, but not way forward. The French have relations over missiles. The British have relations over missiles. But you're seeing each country trying to work out what they want to achieve in Ukraine, and what they want to achieve in Ukraine is largely keeping Ukraine fighting. You're also seeing the Americans increasingly sort of get into Ukraine to see it as a way of supercharging their own industry. That deal is obviously not done yet. It's also entity making some noises about how there seem to be sort of barriers to that. But everyone wants peace in the Ukraine fight because the Ukrainians, I think, have huge amounts of data. So you want to understand data behind modern warfare, then the Ukrainians are the best place to go for it. And they're now playing that game quite powerfully. Again, this is where, Europe is happy for the Ukraine war to continue forever, to be blunt. And, so that the question is, are the Russians and Chinese prepared to play that game? Do the Americans care? But I think Europe views itself as being in Ukraine for the long run. And the other thing is, once the Ukraine war ends, there's talk about bringing Ukraine into the European Union, maybe even NATO. And that means Ukrainian expertise, particularly if it comes to the European Union, will be part of the EU's defense kind of, DNA from the beginning. And the more European Union fights like Ukraine, the harder it will be for Russia to come there in the future.
So in terms of Ukraine's data, what's the significance of that? We've seen these AI drone strikes that are just tipping the balance in terms of logistics. Are they just miles ahead of any other European country in terms of
I
army?
mean, they're not miles ahead. I mean, so the first thing about using weapons in Ukraine is as soon as you start using weapons in the Ukraine, Russia and China start adapting to them. So, the US in particular holds back quite a lot of weapons from Ukraine because, and Iran, because, when they use them, they believe that technology will, although quite a lot of those weapons have been used in epic fury. So where the Ukrainians are ahead is on networking every weapon system and finding cheap solutions to get their weaponry and in a sense talk to each other. So, for example, the Ukrainians have a net of microphones on almost every cell tower that they use to detect drones by detecting the sound signature. Now, lots of countries would like to have that. Quite a lot of countries probably have bits of that now around sort of some locations. But we saw Stephen Driscoll, US Army Secretary, talking at the Hill, so talking in Congress about 3 weeks ago, maybe a bit more, about how the Ukraine is better at networking its soldiers than the US is. And so that's a really big deal. Now, having said that, if you talk to, particularly in the US military, they'll say, well, Ukraine is taking a bunch of risk on that in terms of Chinese components. The US doesn't wish to do. We are just starting to see drone swarms in Ukraine. But what we've seen so far is quite effective Russian jamming against that. So, most of the big defense firms are now in Ukraine. Most of them are flying both one-way and two-way attack drones. So that means both drones that fly straight to a target and those that fly to a target, drop some other drones and then come back. The swarm stuff seems to be very much just starting. But people thought that was going to be starting 2 or 3 years ago. So that is, it's a slower progress, primarily because the Russian incredible most sophisticated. The one area where Russia does not have an edge to say someone like the US or China, but the US in particular, is surveillance and big data crunching. So there's a thing called Project Maven, which is Palantir's targeting web. So that basically ties together America's surveillance system and found targets so that the Americans use that in epic fury. That is the most sophisticated system of its type anyone has ever used. It used up almost all the US military data centers during epic fury. So we're now seeing a race for data. Ukraine is doing cheaper. The Americans are looking for sort of higher quality, and everyone is looking for as much data crunching capacity as they can. Certainly, we're talking about body armor, but also a data center. Really quite sophisticated stuff. And Ukraine is not. Ukraine is doing all of that, but it's doing it sort of built in small businesses. And, the big businesses that supply the US are, they would view sort of in advance of that, but increasingly versions of that technology being trialed in Ukraine. And bits of that we don't get kind of visibility of.
An audience member asks, beyond a simple dictator solidarity, does it really matter to Beijing if Putin's regime collapses?
Yeah, I think it does, because if you look at the way China responded to the Arab Spring, so 2011, those falls of various kind of governments in the Middle East, particularly Muammar Gaddafi, that really worried both China and Russia, but particularly China, because suddenly it looked like those authoritarian regimes might be quite vulnerable. And if you see a bunch of authoritarian regimes, then people worry that they're next. There's a story that Dmitry Medvedev, who was president of Russia at the time, although still really a sort of de facto deputy to Putin, took one look at Gaddafi being killed and said, we're next. And there's no doubt that feeling was kind of shared. It was just as Xi Jinping was taking power in China. And China has become a lot more authoritarian since then. The Chinese Communist Party has really entrenched control. So I think they would be very, very unhappy to see sudden regime change in Russia. And I think Xi personally would, if Putin leaves, they're about the same age, then people start to ask questions over Xi. The broader establishment in both of those countries, of course, do want to make sure that they do have a sort of transition over time. Xi's just purged all his generals from the People's Liberation Army. Yes, that's important. The other thing that's worth looking at, the optics of the most recent Putin-Xi meeting were really interesting. So Xi in particular was presenting the two of them as sort of a bulwark against the law of the jungle, which is what they sort of view as Trumpism, sort of the sort of the unpredictability of the Trump administration. But it also suggests that China feels it has a vested interest in Russia not being chaotic. But all of the mood music, all the ways in which it was filmed and shown was really designed to show Russia as a junior partner. And the longer the Ukraine war goes on, the more Russia is pushed into that position. And there'll be some people in Russia who don't mind that, and there'll be some people who really dislike it.
Another audience question here. Can Ukraine realistically avoid a Chechnya 2 situation, meaning a temporary pause in fighting followed by an even more brutal Russian attack down the line?
Yeah, but I think it can, in the sense that its ability to defend itself is much more than Chechnya had. So Chechnya was not an independent state, particularly after 9/11. The level of support from the Gulf states fell off very substantially. No one was going to back an Islamist insurgency in Chechnya, and the Russians really went for it. Ukraine has two powerful backers, which are the European Union and the United States, and the US, an increasingly good relationship with the Gulf states. So it does have a bunch of relationships it can leverage. And likewise, it's still getting support from China in the sense that China is selling it components for Ukrainian weapons. That could shift, but there are no signs of it doing so. I think the more likely scenario, which is what really got Europe worried, is that a post-war Ukraine looks very hard work for Russia to attack. If Ukraine looks weak at any point, then the Russians will go for it. But if any area on the NATO front line looks weaker, then the Russians may go for that instead. And that's what's really worrying people in Europe. And again, I mean, that's where the US relationship comes in, because the US has been paradoxically getting closer to Ukraine so far this year, but further from European nations.
That's a really interesting point. Would you mind expanding on that a bit more?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, ever since Trump first ran for office in 2015, he's been talking about European nations freeloading on the US, relying on US defense. But we've really seen in the last 4 weeks the US doubling down on that kind of rhetoric. Even people like Marco Rubio, who used to be very pro-NATO, there's real annoyance over some NATO nations denying basing rights during Iran. There's real annoyance over German comments over the US being humiliated. And we just saw yesterday a press release from US European Command talking of right-sizing US forces in Europe. So making it really clear. Up until recently, US generals and so forth have been kind of sending a slightly different message to Trump and Hegseth. They've been saying, we are there, you can rely on us. Now even the generals are saying, you've got to get used to much lower US forces. Pulling US forces out of Poland a few weeks ago really shocked people. Trump then kind of seemed to roll back on that. But the overarching message seems to be, in the event of a war, get used to the idea the Americans are not coming in the kind of numbers that they were. Get used to the fact there'll be less American aircraft, less American long-range missiles, and partly because they're so worried about China, and partly because I think they're genuinely very annoyed over the actions of some European nations.
So America has got bigger things to worry about, in essence.
The Americans believe so. So Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, as we used to refer to it, the guy who runs the Pentagon, was in Singapore for a big conference last week, so just the very end of May. And he was talking about how America's relationship with its Asian Pacific allies, and he name-checked Japan, South Korea, a whole bunch of places that are more partners than allies, places like Thailand, Indonesia. And he was talking about how America's relationship with those nations are based on priorities and interests, but not kind of morals and values. And he was really laying into European states for their moralizing. The one interesting thing about that speech is he did not mention Taiwan by name. So he mentioned the first island chain, which is the geographic entity that includes Taiwan and Japan. And he was pledging to defend that, but not Taiwan by name. And that puts you back in this really messy position that we've talked about before, where America is implying that it might go to war for the protection of Taiwan, but at the same time sending messages going the other way. So Trump just met Xi Jinping a few weeks ago. He was talking about a big arms deal that's going through to Taiwan being a negotiating chip. So America is lining up behind its Pacific allies, but being quite deliberately vague over its actions over Taiwan. But at the same time, it's arming really fast. So the American defense budget, I'm in Washington at the moment, $1.5 trillion. That's about a 40% increase on last year, maybe even a bit more. So, they really are trying to build up those weapon stocks they used up in Iran earlier in the year, trying to build more cheap, attritable weapon systems, so drones, unmanned warships. Right. So to prepare for future conflicts, both in the Pacific, and I think they're realizing they might not be out in the Middle East forever, and dialing back on Europe.
With Western attention heavily split by crises in Europe and the Middle East, how is China subtly changing its tactics towards Taiwan and Japan right now?
So, two really interesting things. On Japan, they're getting much more hawkish. So, Japan itself is doing a lot more militarily aggressive stuff than it's ever done before. They just sent a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait on the anniversary of the treaty of the 19th century. which saw Japan take control of Taiwan. Japan controlled Taiwan between 1890 and 1945. So that was a really kind of ballsy move by Japan. And what you've seen from China, particularly messaging from the Chinese state, the Chinese military, is presenting Japan as a militarizing enemy. A lot of talk about Japan maybe getting atomic weapons, a lot of atomic weapons. So they really are telling their military that Japan is the new enemy. Taiwan is slightly different. So there's a new leader of the main opposition party in Taiwan, the Kuomintang, and she just met with Xi Jinping, and they have elections in 2028. So the Chinese are hoping the Kuomintang will win those elections, and that might open the door to peaceful reunification. If the Kuomintang do not win those elections, and if the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the current party in Taiwan, wins another election and they have very anti-Chinese takeover, then I think you'll see China doubling down on its military threats in 2029. Don't forget, Xi Jinping just fired all of his generals. So I think there's a sudden realization that China's military is not quite ready. But 2029 is 3 years away. They're still rearming fast. And I think from 2029, new American president at that point as well, don't forget, they will be in a position to threaten Taiwan much more.
What's your take on Japan's status, military status? Are they ready?
They're not ready, but like Germany, they are rearming very fast. So the big story, I would say, is that as America, as Trump pursues this America first kind of rhetoric, as there are signs that future presidents, J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio might do the same, much more interest in Latin America. We haven't talked about Cuba, but the Americans, again, signaling they might be ready for an intervention in Cuba. Germany in Europe and Japan in Asia become the two linchpin powers. So what we're seeing is what we started to see from 1948, 49, rearming Japan, rearming Germany as the two principal powers, partnering with the United States up to a point, but very much applying their own fire as well.
There's another question from our audience here. You've argued that Moscow will never willingly surrender land, yet between 1991 and 2008, Russia ceded roughly 67 square miles of territory and hundreds of islands along the Amur River to China. Why is the current era fundamentally different?
Well, firstly, they really hated doing that. I mean, the biggest amount of territory they ceded was giving up Baltic states and Ukraine and all the other Soviet states at the end of the Soviet Union. And they absolutely hated that. And Russia was very much felt in a position of weakness particularly between 1990 and Vladimir Putin taking power in 2000. And since then, yes, I mean, they have ceded small amounts of territory to China, but they have been taking back territory elsewhere since 2008. So South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, both taken back in 2008. Obviously, seizing Crimea in 2014, seizing the Donbass aggressively in 2014, and obviously then trying to take the whole of Ukraine. So I think within Russia, and I think this is even Alexei Navalny, the pro-democracy leader who was killed died under uncertain circumstances in an Arctic prison camp in 2023. Even Alexei Navalny was keen to assert Russian sovereignty over Crimea. And even Boris Yeltsin, from the moment he took power in 1991, was making noises about addressing borders in the Baltic states and Ukraine. So I think, fundamentally, Russia, stronger, energized by oil revenue from the 2000s onwards, it didn't like giving up that territory. It's certainly keen not to give up more territory to China. If you talk to Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians believe that if Putin had successfully seized Ukraine, he would have resettled a lot of Ukrainians on that Pacific border facing towards China and Japan, because he was so worried about particularly that China border in particular. So I think, the Putin era is different, but a lot of it is a reaction against that period of Russian weakness in the 2000s.